Hey guys, welcome back. Back at it again with another lesson 5, Victory for the Allies lecture, PowerPoint, video, Zoom thing. This is the last one we're doing for this year, I believe. So let's go ahead and get started. So lesson 5, Victory for the Allies. This is going to be a really good picture of Soviet and American soldiers finally meeting at the Elbe River in Eastern Germany. Right, this is where you're going to see the two forces finally be able to meet. You know, Germany being in the middle. So it's going to be a very symbolic picture that's going to be, it's going to resonate for the rest of time when we talk about World War II. So let's get started. Here are going to be your learning objectives. These are the things you're going to learn about this little video. Right, you're going to be able to understand the reasons for the final defeat of the Nazis, describe how the Allies began to push back the Japanese in the Pacific, explain how the dropping of the atomic bombs ended the war, describe the aftermath of World War II and the founding of the United Nations. So these are going to be your key terms. Your VE Day, which is Victory in Europe Day, Bataan Death March, Island Hopping, Douglas MacArthur, Kamikaze, Manhattan Project, Harry Truman, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, Nuremberg trials, and the United Nations, or the UN. So let's get started with the end of the war in Europe. By early spring 1945, the war in Europe was nearing its end. That April, the Allies lost a key leader, Franklin Roosevelt, right? FDR dies. Though he did not live to see the final victory, he knew the defeat of the Nazis was inevitable. FDR, this is something that we would talk about if we were actually in person. FDR had polio. His condition got worse through his presidency, his multiple presidencies. Fun fact, he's the only president to serve more than 2 terms. I think he serves like 3.5, 4. Well, he dies. So they're actually going to make an amendment that you can't run more than twice, right? He's the only one that does it, and he actually gets elected more than twice. So fun fact, right? But he is going to die, but it's not going to be that much big of a deal in terms of our military or in terms of our progress in Europe, because it was pretty much wrapped up. The war was pretty much wrapped up. The only thing that we really had to worry about was the Pacific Front with Japan. All right, so we're going to talk about Germany being defeated and the reasons for victory in Europe. So if we look here, class, here's a perfect map of really what we're trying to explain in terms of the 2 fronts, right? So when you look at here, right, the axes are going to be in red. So everything in red is going to be Axis controlled or Axis allied, right? Everything in blue is going to be the Allies, right? So you're going to have Russia to the east, and you're going to have the triumvirate. You're going to have France, the United States, and England. They're the United Kingdom. So really what they're trying to do is they're trying to squeeze as much life out of Germany as possible until, right, Germany's not going to be able to fight both sides at once. They're going to have to pick a side. Whatever side they pick, they're ruined from the other side. So if they decide to really defend themselves against the Russians, well, then this triple team right here is going to completely just storm through them. And if Germany decides to defend over here to the west, well, they know that a very angry Russia is breathing down their necks. So they're kind of in a very bad predicament. So that's what that looks like. Now, Germany is going to be defeated. By March 1945, the Allies crossed the Rhine, which is a river, into Western Germany. From the east, Soviet ships closed in on Berlin. In late of April, American and Soviet soldiers shook hands at the Elbe, which was that picture I showed you. All over Europe, Axis armies began to surrender. In Italy, guerrillas captured and executed Mussolini. Soviet troops made way into Berlin. Hitler committed suicide in his underground bunker. After just 12 years, Hitler's 1,000-year Reich was bomb-ravaged and in ruins. On May 7th, Germany surrendered. Officially, the war in Europe ended the next day, which is May 8th, which is now proclaimed forever from that day as VE Day, the Victory in Europe Day. So these are multiple things are going to happen. Italy is going to not have a resurgence, very similar to France, because France is going to be very democratic. France is going to be very, actually, give me 1 second. Hey, I'm recording a video. All right. Yes, bye. Sorry about that. So in Italy, it's not going to be the same types of fanfare that that France is going to get when France becomes liberated. Of course, right, there's people in the country controlling their government, right? Italy's not that way. Italy decided to do this with Mussolini. So a lot of the guerrillas, there's going to be a lot of smaller factions that are going to be against it and want democracy and want peace, right? And those guerrillas are going to get their hands on Mussolini and completely just desecrate his body. They're going to hang him from, I think, the town square in Rome. So everyone in Italy can see him hanging, right? Just to make just to symbolize to the rest of the country that we're no longer this monstrous, very nationalistic country that's dead, right? Along with Mussolini, you see him hanging. And he was there, I think left hanging there for like, 2 days, right? So as that's Mussolini, so as the Soviet troops finally made their way, right, class, I told you that they completely just ran into Germany. And as Hitler was listening to the news, he was figuring out that it was, any hour now that the Soviets were going to completely invade Berlin, which is going to be the capital of Germany, that they're going to go ahead and he's going to kill himself, right? He supposedly takes him and his wife, Eva Braun, they take a capsule of cyanide and they shoot each other in the head, or he shoots them in the head and shoots himself in the head, right? So he ensures that he's dead, right? So that's really marks the end of World War II, right? The two great, the great dictators of the time, Mussolini and Hitler, are dead. So eventually, May 8th, everyone's going to go ahead and sign the peace treaties, and World War II is officially over. Now, reasons for victory in Europe, right? These are going to be the three main reasons why the Allies win. The first one is Hitler insists on making major military decisions himself, and some proved disasters, especially the invasion of the Soviet Union. He underestimated the ability of the Soviet Union to fight in defense of the land, right? He's going to make the same mistake that countless other people have made throughout history, right? Most notably Napoleon, where he's going to really take forces away from what's working, right? If that great saying, right? If it isn't broke, don't fix it, right? He's going to try to fix something that isn't broken, right? He's going to take his forces away and concentrate on another aspect where he's winning, right? So he's winning the Western Front. He's dominating the Western Front. He goes in there, completely demolishes France. He thinks too highly of himself, takes some of those forces away, right, class? And he ships them off to Russia. So two things happen. We've talked about this before. Britain is able to catch its breath. Britain is able to, to recuperate, to recover, and be able to make an effort to go forward, right? And that's going to be huge. That's a big sigh of relief for the UK, right? And the second thing is that a lot of his troops are going to die in Russia, right? He's not going to realize how much Russians care about themselves and their motherland, and that's going to bite him in the butt. Now, the second one is going to be the enormous productive capacity of the U.S. was another factor. By 1944, the U.S. was producing twice as much as all of the Axis powers combined, right? When we think of the United States, right, people fail, especially if you're not from the United States, people fail to remember how absolutely massive our country is, how massive our production can be, right? When you think of Germany, right, class, let's go back and look at that picture of Germany, right? If you look at Germany is not that big, right? It's pretty big for Europe, but that's the size of like maybe 3 states, in the Midwest. It's not that big. So when you have massive cities, right, in the United States that are all they're focusing on is producing for the war effort, right? You have massive industrial cities like Detroit, Chicago, Los Angeles, San Diego, New York, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, Miami, right? You have all of these major cities that's all they're focusing on. It's going to blow away all competition, right? Until later, right? Until we get to China, but that's for another thing, right? But just the sheer amount of people that can be put to work and the sheer amount of just products that the United States are going to be able to make at such an incredible speed is going to blow everyone out of the water, right, class? Now, the third thing, to go on with that point, is this right here is going to be a factory in, I believe, Texas, right? I believe it's somewhere in Texas, where they're going to convert a factory that was used to make like trucks. I think like actual like farm trucks, like factory trucks, and they're going to go ahead and use it as an assembly line for planes. And as you can see, class, these factories are, hundreds of yards, just miles long. And in these factories, they're going to be able to churn out just massive amounts of planes. It's really uncomprehensible. Like, you just can't really put, unless you see it happening in real time, right, class? It's really mind-boggling. And so that's what's really going to put us over the edge. And the third thing is, in 1942, Germany and its allies had to fight on several fronts simultaneously, right? Hitler deciding to go into Russia is going to create a second front. And then Italy getting ransacked in the south by Eisenhower, right? That's going to create a third front that Hitler has to send troops to, and that's just going to be too much. His forces are going to be spread too thin. Now, battles in the Pacific. So now let's focus back to the Pacific, into Asia. During the War of the Pacific, the Japanese at first won a string of victories. They also controlled much of China and Southeast Asia. Despite the early Japanese advances, the Allies slowly turned the tide. And here we're going to talk about the Bataan Death March and the Americans' take offensive. So the Bataan Death March. Just hours after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese bombed the Philippines, which the U.S. had control of since 1898. Remember, class, we got the Philippines from the Spanish-American War. In a few short months, the Philippines were under Japanese control. After the Japanese invasion, they forced their prisoners to march more than 60 miles in incredible heat with almost no water or food. The cruel Bataan Death March resulted in the death of as many as 10,000 prisoners. So these prisoners here, class, that, this is going to be a picture taken from that time during the Death March. These people are going to be Americans that are stationed in the Philippines. It's going to be a lot of Filipino resistance fighters. It's going to be a lot of people who are anti-Japanese imperialism. It's going to be a lot of people who really have nothing to do with it, right, class? Like we said before, the people who suffer the most in war are going to be the innocent, right? And here it's going to be 10,000 prisoners die, right? And the sad thing is, many Filipino civilians risked and sometimes lost their lives to get food and water to captives along the march. Right? Just being a good person, seeing someone really just dying of dehydration, dying of starvation, right? Marching to literally nowhere, right? They're just marching in a straight line for 60 miles. If you don't want to try to give them water, if you don't want to try to give them food to try to help their survival, what does it say about you? So the people who do actually try and who aren't afraid of the Japanese, the people who are actually going to try to give them water, try to give them food, right? A lot of them will get scolded. A lot of them will get in trouble. A lot of them will just get shot at and killed, right? And so that's going to increase this death toll in the Philippines, right? This Bataan Death March is really going to set the tone for how the U.S. is really going to view the Japanese. The Japanese are going to be incredibly brutal. The Japanese are going to be incredibly, for lack of a better word, just very cruel and evil, especially to the people that they take over, the subjects. They're imperialist subjects. I'm not going to get into much detail about it. You can if you want, but what the Japanese would do to the Chinese, especially when they were invading. There's a really famous account called the Rape of Nanking, which is a period of time where they went into the city of Nanking and pretty much did whatever they want to the civilians that lived there. A lot of innocent men, children, women were murdered, raped, pillaged. They burned a lot of buildings to the ground, apartment buildings into the ground. They stole, they looted. It was just a terrible example. And that's the most famous one. They did that to multiple cities, multiple times. We'll go ahead and talk about. Well, I'm not going to go ahead and talk about, but normally we would, but about some of their own death camps that they had, where they were performing their own versions of what was going on in Auschwitz and in Treblinka and what they're doing medically to a lot of these people, right? A lot of really bad medical experiments to see how far a human could go before it dies. So, for example, we took a lot of the records after the war, and a lot of it was pretty valuable in terms of of things that, oh, that's nice to know, I guess, since you've already done it. But for example, like how long a person could possibly stay in water before he dies, how long before a person on average gets hypothermia, right? What they would do is they would force these people to really just to suffer, and they would torture them in these experiments and see how far the body can take before it breaks down and dies, right? So the Japanese, in American eyes, right, and just the rest of the world, right, they're going to be viewed as very brutal, and we're going to try, the United States, especially after the Bataan Death March, we're really going to go ahead and try to keep a distance from them, right? And I'll explain that in a little bit. Now, Americans take the offensive. The summer after the Battle of Midway, the United States took the offensive, right? We're finally going to attack them ourselves. The U.S. Marines landed at Guadalcanal, the Solomon Islands. This victory marked the beginning of an island hopping campaign, right? That's a vocab word. Make sure you guys write that down. The goal of the campaign was to recapture some Japanese-held islands while bypassing others. So there's a video here that I attached. Go ahead and watch that. It already explains in great detail what island hopping is. I'll try to explain a little bit, but it goes into better detail. Here's a link to a video that showcases just how deadly the Pacific Front was. This is taken from a movie, Band of Brothers, where it really shows you what it was like storming the beaches, right? It's awful. It's everything that's terrible about trench warfare, but even worse because it's completely one-sided. And what do I mean by that? I'll explain in a little bit. But the idea of island hopping is the Pacific is set up, right? Let's look at here. The Pacific is set up of a bunch of little islands, right? A bunch of little islands. So here's the Coral Sea next to Australia, right? Here's the Marshall Islands, Hawaii, right? The Mariana, the Manila, right? There's a bunch of a ton, I'm like hundreds of islands in the Pacific. So what the Japanese would do is the Japanese would go and they would set up little camps. They would set up little naval bases, Air Force bases in these little islands. So that way, instead of having to fly from Japan to attack, American ships in the Pacific, they could take off from the island and go back to refuel, and it's a lot faster, right? But what the United States would do is we quickly realized that we can't take every island. So instead, we'll just ignore some of them and go from island to island, right? Skipping every few. So that way we'd go and say, which one of these, right, from the Solomon Islands, which one of these islands is the most important? And we'll go and get the two most important and just ignore the other ones, right? And that's what it means by island hopping, right? We're going from one island or one set of islands to the next to eventually get to this island, right, Japan. So we'd start in Hawaii, we'd win Wake Island, we'd win the Marshall Islands, we'll go into the Caroline, and then we'll eventually just go hop and hop and hop and hop until eventually, they don't have the capacity to go ahead and attack us. So each captured island served as a stepping stone, like I just said, to the next objective. As a result, U.S. forces led by General Douglas MacArthur, he's going to be the general in charge of the Pacific Front. On the captured islands, the Americans built air bases to enable them to carry the war closer to Japan. By 1944, the U.S. Navy commander, Admiral Chester Nimitz, had blockaded Japan, and American bombers pounded Japanese cities and industries. By 1944, MacArthur began to fight to retake the Philippines. The British, meanwhile, were pushing back Japanese forces into Burma and Malaya. So if you look over here on this side, right, you're going to see a lot of the English, and they're going to start fighting this way, right? Malaya here is going to be a UK. They're eventually going to be able to take it, and Burma is going to be over here as well. And so now, after the fall of Germany, now we're going to finally get some help ourselves in the Pacific. And yeah, the thing, there it is, right? The thing that's interesting here is that the United States is finally going to be able to use a lot of the tactics, I should say, right? It's a lot of the tactics that we learned from the Germans, right? Although we didn't have the ability to use the blitzkrieg strategy of bombing and then having people rush in. But really what we were doing is we're starting to see which areas of the country were important in terms of creating, products, of manufacturing, of shipyards. Where are they building the ships? Where are they building their guns? Where are they building their boats or whatever? And we would use this knowledge and bomb it, right? The same way that the Germans were doing to the English and the French. And the United States is going to do this with incredible efficiency, right? We're going to have a really good idea of what would best hurt Japan. And the second thing, which is really, really, it's really sad, is that Japanese traditionally have always built their buildings with wood, traditional wood buildings in Japan. And this is before they modernized, right? This is before, right? They didn't have to, because why would they? And what we decided to do was use a lot of firebombs, right? We pretty much burned down most of the country. And it still didn't do anything to them. That's the thing that's crazy, right? There's statistics that, that equate where we were Nagasaki, Hiroshima, Kobe, Kyoto, right? These major cities, industrial cities, were burned to the ground. 50% of the city was gone, right? But they still kept going, right? Japan was incredibly brutal, and they were incredibly not afraid, right? They were not afraid to keep fighting at all costs, right? And that's what really scared the United States about trying to invade Japan, right? That's why we kind of skipped from island to island, because we didn't want to fight an enemy who was literally would rather die than stop, right? There's no such thing as surrender, right, for the Japanese. And that's scary to go against. That's not fun to fight. That's fighting war is not fun at all, right? But it's especially fun when you literally have to fight to the death, right? That's something completely different. So we're going to talk about the end of the war in the Pacific. With War I in Europe, the Allies poured their resources into defeating Japan. By mid-1945, most of the Japanese Navy and Air Force had been destroyed. Yet the Japanese still had an army of over 2 million men. The road to victory, it appeared, would be long and costly. Right, class? So knowing that, Japan didn't necessarily even have to use a lot of their soldiers. And the soldiers that they did use didn't really go against any opposition, right? China wasn't fighting back. Of course, they were, but not to the extent as much as the UK with the troops or Russian troops, right? They didn't lose a lot of soldiers. So they had a standing army of 2 million men, right? I believe at the time that was more than us, alone. And we're going to talk about these 4 things when we talk about the end of the war in the Pacific, how Japan just resisted a powerful new weapon, which is going to be a dropping of the atomic bomb, and an ongoing controversy. We're going to talk about the after effects of dropping that bomb. Right, Japanese resistance. As American forces closed in Japan, the Japanese put up a fierce resistance. By 1944, young Japanese kamikaze pilots were undertaking suicide missions, crashing the explosive leading airplanes into American warships. The next year, battles on the islands of Iwo Jima from spring of 1945 and the summer of 1945, Japanese forces showed that they would, from the spring to the summer, Japanese forces showed that they would fight to the death rather than surrender. Some American officials estimated that in the invasion of Japan, it would be a cost of 1 million or more casualties. Right, class? When we talk about the idea of invading Japan, it would pretty much have been a suicide mission, not just for us, right? But it also would have costed Japan millions of people, right, their lives. And a lot of American officials and a lot of, our allied officials didn't really want that to happen, right? They didn't want more death, because when you looked at the numbers of people who died in Germany, the amount of French, the Russians, we didn't want more people to die, ultimately. So this is going to lead to a development of a powerful new weapon, right? Since the early 1900s, scientists understood that matter made up of atoms could be converted into pure energy. Whether that's by fission, where you group them together with ionic bonds, or through, fission is of separating, right? You split the atom, and then fusion is where you, through covalent bonds, I believe, I'm just talking out of my butt. But one of the bonds with covalent, ionic, whatever, right? You create energy by either slamming atoms together or ripping them apart, right? Could be converted into pure energy. In military terms, this method, by splitting the atom, scientists could create an explosion far more powerful than anything ever, right? It's going to be the greatest explosion, man-made, probably the most destructive thing we'll ever make, that we know of. During the war, Allied scientists, some of them German and Italian refugees, raced to harness the atom before the Germans could. In July 1945, the top-secret Manhattan Project successfully tested the first atomic bomb in Alamogordo, New Mexico. That bomb is going to be called Trinity. It's going to be called this, it's the start of the program. It's going to be exploded off, a couple miles away from an Air Force base in New Mexico. There is footage of it. There's footage of all of this. However, class, the top secret Manhattan Project is going to be a group of scientists at Cal Berkeley, at Cal, where they're going to go ahead and, led by Robert Oppenheimer. It's going to be a group of people who are really, in their eyes, are in a race against the Germans, right? There is reports coming from, espionage missions and spies from Germany saying that Germany is really close to, for them, creating a weapon like this, right? They called it the Wonder, I forget exactly what it is, but it's their version of a Wonder Weapon, or it's like Wonder Bus or something like that. I forget what it is exactly. But there are scientists who are, at this point were ahead of us, right? Their scientists were at another level, but they concentrated on V2 rocket technology, right? What they really focused on is how to make their jets better, how to make their Luftwaffe better, how to make rockets better. They didn't really concentrate as much as we did on the boom, right? They concentrated more on how do I get the boom to you, if that makes any sense, right? We just wanted the biggest explosion we possibly could, right? Because we just figured, hey, if someone sees that and isn't scared and doesn't stop, well, then we'll make them go boom, right? So that's what the Manhattan Project was. News of the test was brought to new U.S. President Harry Truman. He realized that the atomic bomb was a terrible force of destruction. Still, after consulting with advisors, he decided to use the new weapon against Japan. Truman believed that dropping the atomic bomb would bring the war to a faster end and save American lives. At the time, Truman was meeting with other Allied leaders in the city of Potsdam, Germany. They issued a warning to Japan to surrender or face complete destruction and utter devastation. When the Japanese ignored that warning, the United States took action. We're eventually going to drop the atomic bombs. On August 6, 1945, the American plane, the Enola Gay, dropped an atomic bomb over the city of Hiroshima. It instantly killed, and I'm talking about instantly killed, more than 70,000 people at once, followed by many more dead from radiation sickness, a deadly after effect of exposure to radioactive materials. On August 8th, the USSR declared war on Japan and invaded Manchuria, which is a part of China. Again, Japanese leaders did not respond. The next day, the US dropped a second atomic bomb. This time, the city of Nagasaki. More than 40,000 people were killed in the second explosion. Some members of the Japanese cabinet wanted to fight on. Other leaders disagreed. Finally, on August 10th, Emperor Hirohito intervened, an action unheard of a Japanese emperor. He forced the government to surrender. On September 2nd, 1945, the formal peace treaty was signed on board the American battleship, the Missouri, anchored in Tokyo Bay. After more than 5 years of fighting, World War II was finally over. This is really this idea here. Let me keep reading. Right, and an ongoing controversy. Right, it's going to be the idea of using the atomic bomb and us actually using the atomic bomb was extremely controversial. Right, using the atomic bomb against Japan brought a quick end. It also unleashed terrifying destruction. Ever since, people debate whether or not the U.S. should have used the bomb. For President Truman, using the bomb was a difficult decision. He later explained that he only made this decision based only on military considerations. He was concerned that Japan would not surrender without an invasion, and that would cost an enormous loss of lives. Right? Most importantly, it would have cost us a lot of American lives. After all, the Japanese still had a home army of 2 million soldiers, like I said earlier. Critics of Truman's decisions argue that Japan was almost defeated at that point and the bomb was not needed. They also claimed that by using the atomic bomb, the U.S. unleashed a dangerous arms race that grew over the next decades. We'll talk about that later. Growing differences between the U.S. and the USSR may also have influenced Truman's decision. Truman may have hoped the bomb would impress the Soviets with American power. The debate over Truman's decision has continued to the present. Now, why is this debated? So you can make a lot of historians will make the argument that using the bomb was a necessity, right? And I kind of agree with it. I kind of agree with it in terms of of these two things, right? If we would have continued with the invasion, if we would have actually tried to have a land invasion very similar to what we did with Normandy, right, we would have lost hundreds of thousands of more soldiers, gone, right, for no reason, right? Hundreds of thousands of Japanese would have died, right? We would have had battles in pretty much every major city, right? Because Japan was never going to, right? And this is actually backed up by a lot of the decisions that a lot of the head of the governments in Japan made at the time. If the United States were to invade and they did go into different cities, right, it would have continued to be total war the same way that Russia would fought back with the Germans, right? The Japanese were going to fight back to the Americans with the British. So this would have been a terrible idea because then that would have cost millions of lives, right? Not just the 2 million soldiers, but a lot more innocent lives, right? Now would have cost, right, 70 plus 40, that's 100, that's over 100,000 people. Would have been that many people? Maybe more, or we don't know, right? But this decision was used, right, as seen kind of as the most humane way to end the war, if that makes any sense. And it did end the war, but it also completely changed the way war will be fought forever, right? It's going to lead to the Cold War, right? Another reason why people think that Truman really decided to use the atomic bombs was to pretty much flex, and it's terrible the way to say this, but to pretty much flex and show off to the Russians, saying, hey, we understand that you're powerful, right? And you pretend to not know that we're powerful, but here, look at this. Can you do this? Right? And at the time they couldn't, but they figured it out very quickly, right? They were able to create their own atomic bombs, and that led to an arms race that was very scary in the 70s, the 60s, the 80s. My dad, my grandpa growing up, not knowing if he was going to get, bombed, right? Just the idea of even my dad, right? They would have atomic bomb drills in high school. He would have to, hug the wall pretty much because, and even if you did that, it wouldn't have mattered, because you would have been disintegrated. And it's still a very controversial topic to get brought up. And just a quick more things that we want to talk about real quick is that eventually Japan does eventually, right? They give up. They quit. We gave Japan some time to come up with that decision, right? Because we didn't bomb them day after day. It was we bombed them, we waited a while, then we bombed them again, we waited a while. If they wouldn't have said anything, then there's thoughts that we would have bombed them again for a third time. And if we would have, then that would have been proven disastrous because the cities that we bombed were chosen for a reason. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were bombed because they were very important industrial cities. And once we bombed those, they were completely destroyed. That really crippled their economy. That really crippled their manufacturing process. And so it was kind of more symbolic in terms of we're not going to try to kill as many people as we want as possible, but we're really going to try to knock off this part of your economy, knock off this part of your manufacturing, and really cripple the country. But the third one, there is some memos that got declassified a couple of years ago where they discussed bombing of Kyoto, which is one of the major cities, of bombing of Tokyo, which is the capital city. Right, there's millions of people living there. They would have just died instantly. I don't think that would have happened. I really doubt we would have bombed their capital. I really doubt we would have bombed Kyoto because of how much it means culturally, and how much cultural and religious significance it has for Japan. So I think it would have either been like Kobe or another kind of other city that's big enough to where it's another punch to the face. But it's really. And here, class, I went ahead and this linked up. I went ahead and I gave you guys multiple videos. I gave you guys 7 videos of what this A-bomb was and what it looked like, some of the footage of them testing it out. Here, there's some very disturbing, just to let you guys know, there's some disturbing footage of just the aftermath and the idea of, the atomic bomb shadows, where you know, that the blasts from the atomic bombs are so hot that they would, you know, your body would just disintegrate to nothing. It would vaporize. You just gone. That the bombs were, they were so hot. The energy release was so hot that it would bleach the surface of whatever the blast hit, that whatever saw the blast. And if a person was in the way, the shadow that that person cast would be stained, right, for lack of a better term, would be stained onto a wall, so you could see where people were standing, right, when the bomb went off. You can see where things were, and it's terrifying to think about. You know, there's footage of just the radioactive decay a lot of these people went through, a lot of the radio, you know, the radiation poisoning, radiation sickness that really killed a lot of people, and it's just a very bad thing that we did. You know, it took, I think up to President Obama to apologize for the bombings. You know, when we think about the bombs, right, we kind of always, you know, I did, at least when I was in high school, when I was learning about this, was I viewed this as yeah, we were the ones that made it, like, yeah, like we ended the war, like we showed Japan. But the more and more you read about it, the more and more just absolutely heartbreaking it is. That we probably didn't need to send the second one. We probably didn't need to do that. And ultimately it's going to lead down, you know, a Cold War that it's really not going to be good either. So who knows what happened, right? It's one of those butterfly effects where we don't really know what could have happened or what should have happened. End of the war in the Pacific. Here's going to be pictures of kamikazes flying their planes into the warships. Now, the cost of war, right, class, we're going to go ahead, and it really just talks about, right, what it looked like, about, you know, just the absolute just destruction and dismay of Europe after this. We're finally going to realize what the Holocaust was all about. It's going to actually hit the popular media. Actual newspapers are going to be writing about it, showing pictures of it, and it's going to be just absolutely disgusting. We're going to have a video here about the Nuremberg trials. Here, I believe it's Göring, who is a German commander who's actually going to not kill himself. He wasn't that much of a coward, but he's actually going to face trial. He's actually going to trial, the Nuremberg trials, where he has to get judged by a court and by a judge. And eventually he does kill himself. He swallows cyanide and kills himself. But yeah, where you actually have to be held accountable for what you did during times of war. That's going to be huge. Japanese Prime Minister Hideki Tojo is going to be executed for what he did against the Chinese and the Americans, for his war crimes, and so on and so forth. And then the big thing that comes out of this, you know, one, you know, glowing positive thing that came out of this is the United Nations. The United Nations is formed. Now, the structure of the United Nations is going to be really fun to think about. And that's pretty much it. That's going to be the United Nations structured. And that's going to be, you know, they offer a lot of humanitarian aid. They do a lot of good for Africa and, you know, parts of Asia and India and stuff like that, where there's a lot of poverty in especially South America. And they're going to go ahead and form, you know, foundations like UNICEF and the World Wildlife Fund, right? WWF, the one with the panda on it, right? And so on and so forth, right? So they're gonna go ahead and do good things. Here's your guys' questions. I believe that's everything. So I'll go ahead and I'll talk to you guys soon. Okay. Thank you for watching. Bye-bye.